It was just before dawn in the early hours of June 5th, 1960. The surface of Lake Bodom, nestled in the quiet Finnish countryside near the town of Espoo, lay still beneath the soft blanket of mist that hovered gently above the water. Not far from the lake's edge, a pair of bicycles leaned against a tree, almost artfully arranged, as if their owners had just stepped away to enjoy the view. But something was wrong. A green tent, barely visible from the dirt trail that wound along the lakeside, had collapsed inward. Not from wind, or rain, or age, but from something else, something far darker. Inside the tent, and sprawled around it, were the brutalized bodies of teenagers, 3 dead, 1 clinging to life. It would become one of Finland's most notorious unsolved crimes, a chilling case that would baffle detectives for decades and leave the quiet forests around Lake Bodom forever changed. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story already, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It helps more than you know, and builds a community of listeners who love to unravel mysteries together. Now let's go back to a time before the headlines, before the fear, before Lake Bodom became a name whispered in true crime circles and bedtime horror stories. Let's begin with 4 teenagers on a carefree weekend trip. They were young, ordinary, and looking for adventure. Seppo Boisman was 18, a cheerful and confident boy, fond of motorbikes and music. He was dating 15-year-old Anja Mäki, who was sweet and quiet, with a round face and long hair she often tucked behind her ears. Seppo's best friend, Nils Gustafsson, was also 18, a stocky, affable boy with a dry sense of humor and a laid-back style. He'd recently started dating Maila Emeli Björklund, also 15, a soft-spoken girl who preferred books to loud parties. The 4 teenagers had planned a small weekend escape, a night of camping under the stars, away from the eyes of parents and neighbors, surrounded only by pine trees and the serene ripple of the lake. They set off with bicycles, a green canvas tent, snacks, soft drinks, and summer sleeping bags. They chose a secluded spot near the shore, about 1 kilometer from the main trail, a peaceful clearing tucked just enough into the woods to give them privacy, but close enough to feel safe. This was the kind of summer trip many Finnish teens took, innocent, joyful, simple. They arrived on Saturday afternoon, June 4th. The weather was pleasant, if a bit cloudy. Locals passing by the lake that evening would later report hearing the group laughing and talking quietly. Some saw them fishing. Others saw the silhouette of the tent in the fading dusk. It all seemed ordinary, but by the next morning, 3 of them would be dead. The discovery was made by a man named Esko Johansson, who was out for a swim with his son early Sunday morning. He noticed the tent looked odd, flattened, leaning to one side. As he moved closer, he realized something far more disturbing. The fabric of the tent was slashed, ragged, uneven tiers like it had been attacked from the outside, and there was blood. Esko rushed to contact the police, and soon the peaceful lakeside was swarming with uniformed officers, medical personnel, and curious locals who had heard the rumors and come to see for themselves. What they found inside and around the tent was something no one could have prepared for. Seppo Boisman was dead, lying partially outside the tent. Anja Mäki had suffered a brutal attack. Maila Emeli Björklund had the worst of it, stab wounds and blunt force trauma, with her body found outside the tent in a particularly vicious state. Some reports said she was partially undressed, leading to speculation about a possible sexual motive. Only Nils Gustafsson had survived, barely. He had a fractured jaw, heavy bruising, and deep knife wounds. He was in shock and unable to speak coherently. The scene was gruesome and confusing. There were no signs of forced entry. The tent had been slashed from the outside, suggesting a sudden, frenzied attack. But valuables, including money and wristwatches, were untouched. The killer, or killers, had struck in the dead of night and vanished without a trace. It was as if a ghost had slipped through the woods, done the unthinkable, and evaporated into the mist. In the early days, the investigation struggled. The The Finnish police were not prepared for a crime of this magnitude. Crime scenes weren't secured properly. Curious townsfolk wandered into the area before forensics could be gathered. Photographs were taken late. Evidence was misplaced. Even the bikes had been handled by multiple people before they were considered part of the crime scene. Officers questioned dozens of locals, but no solid leads emerged. Nils, the only survivor, was hospitalized for weeks. When he finally recovered enough to speak, his memories were foggy. He remembered the attack in fragments, a shadowy figure, possibly dressed in red, a blinding pain, chaos. But no name, no face. The media dubbed it the Lake Bodom murders, and the story spread like wildfire. Who would want to kill teenagers in their sleep? Was it someone they knew? A jealous ex? A drifter? A maniac? Over the next few months, police would investigate more than 300 suspects. Some were local troublemakers. Others were loners who matched vague witness descriptions. One suspect, a man named Hans Assmann, would become a central figure in later theories. But at the time, there wasn't enough evidence to arrest anyone. The case went cold. For years, the mystery of Lake Bodom would hang over Finland like a dark cloud, talked about in hushed tones at dinner tables, retold at sleepovers, and analyzed by amateur sleuths. People speculated endlessly, pointing fingers and crafting theories that ranged from plausible to bizarre. What made it worse was how ordinary it all was. 4 kids, a summer trip, and then nothing but blood and silence. But time doesn't always erase. Sometimes, it reveals, and decades later, in a shocking twist, the only survivor, Nils Gustafsson, would be accused of the murders himself. What had once been thought of as a brutal attack he barely escaped became something darker. Was he the killer all along? The story of Lake Bodom had just begun to unravel. When investigators first entered the scene at Lake Bodom in the early hours of June 5, 1960, they expected 4 dead bodies. But instead they found 3 lifeless teenagers, and 1 boy who was still breathing. That boy was Nils Gustafsson. His injuries were visible and disturbing. His jaw was fractured, his face was bruised and swollen, and he had deep knife wounds on his arms. His shoes were found about 500 meters away, as if he had wandered in confusion or fled before collapsing. When police reached him, he was lying outside the tent, unconscious, face down in the dirt. He was alive, but he couldn't speak. For a while, Nils was the only hope for answers. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, and news of his survival spread across the country within hours. The press painted him as a tragic figure, the lone boy who lived through a nightmare. At first, people hoped that when he recovered, he might remember something, anything, that could help catch whoever had done this. But when he awoke, his mind was a blank slate, or so he said. In the days that followed, Nils gave vague accounts of the night. He remembered that the group had been in good spirits. They had set up the tent, fished a little, and sat talking into the evening. There had been no arguments, no fights, nothing unusual. Then, darkness. He remembered being woken up suddenly, feeling pain and confusion. He said he caught a glimpse of the attacker, maybe wearing red, maybe blonde. It was unclear. He described a shadowy figure, slashing at the tent from the outside. He remembered chaos, screams, and then nothing. He blacked out. To many it sounded like the story of a boy in shock. But to the police, especially those already under pressure for a botched crime scene, it wasn't much help. His memory gaps were understandable, but frustrating. With no clear description of the killer, and no known motive, the investigation quickly started to stagnate. For weeks, detectives chased leads. They talked to locals, combed the nearby woods, and appealed to the public for any information. Dozens of people came forward, claiming to have seen something strange: men walking alone near the lake, distant screams, lights in the woods, but none of the accounts were consistent. A few suspects were brought in for questioning, including a German man living nearby, and a Finnish construction worker with a history of mental illness. But nothing stuck. Then came the rumors. One name that began to circulate in whispers was Hans Assmann. Assmann was a mysterious man, a former member of the German Waffen-SS, who had moved to Finland after the war. He lived not far from Lake Bodom, and was known for odd behavior. On the day after the murders, hospital staff in Helsinki reported that Assmann came in covered in what appeared to be blood. He was nervous, agitated, and claimed he'd cut himself in an accident. But strangely, no police followed up. Why? It was later suggested, though never proven, that Assmann may have had ties to the Finnish Security Intelligence Service. Some conspiracy theorists believe he was protected because of his past, or even used as a covert asset. Whatever the truth, police seemed oddly uninterested in pursuing him seriously. He denied any involvement in the murders, and died in 1998, never having been charged. Still, for many true crime enthusiasts, Assmann remained a haunting what-if. Meanwhile, Nils tried to return to normal life. He eventually completed his military service, got married, and started a career as a bus driver. For decades, he stayed out of the spotlight, living quietly and refusing interviews. Most people assumed he had simply survived something so horrific that he wanted to forget it. And then, nearly 44 years later, the story exploded all over again. It was 2004 when Finnish police made a stunning announcement. After re-examining the case with modern forensic methods, including blood spatter analysis and DNA testing, they believed they had finally solved the Lake Bodom murders. Their suspect, Nils Gustafsson, the lone survivor, the boy who had been treated as a victim for over 4 decades. Investigators now claimed that Nils's injuries had not matched the profile of someone attacked by an outside assailant. Instead, they argued, his wounds were self-inflicted, or at the very least less severe than previously thought. More damningly, they pointed to newly analyzed blood evidence, which they claimed showed that Nils's blood was found on the inside of the tent in a position inconsistent with his story. The theory, according to police, was this: the group had been drinking that night. An earlier toxicology report indicated low levels of alcohol in their systems. A fight had broken out, possibly due to jealousy or romantic tension. Nils, they believed, had flown into a rage, attacking his friends. Afterward, he staged the scene to look like an attack from outside. It was a bold claim, and not everyone bought it. Many experts and civilians alike found the theory hard to believe. For one thing, it required Nils to have inflicted serious injuries on himself, including a broken jaw and deep stab wounds, without passing out or leaving more obvious evidence of deception. His wife, who had been married to him for decades, publicly defended him, calling the charges ludicrous. So did several prominent criminal profilers in Finland. One psychologist said the idea that a teenager could murder his girlfriend and best friends in a fit of rage, and then cover it up so convincingly for over 40 years, simply didn't add up. Yet the prosecution pressed forward. In 2005, Nils Gustafsson, by then 63 years old, stood trial for the murder of his friends. It was one of the most high-profile court cases in Finnish history. The courtroom was tense. The media swarmed outside. People lined up to witness history. The quiet man who had once been seen as a symbol of survival was now being painted as a cold-blooded killer. The prosecution laid out their case: the blood evidence, the supposed inconsistencies, and the motive of jealousy. They argued that Nils had snapped after a heated exchange with Seppo, possibly related to Mila. The defense countered with just as much force. They highlighted the weaknesses in the forensic analysis. They questioned the logic of a man maintaining innocence for over 4 decades, without a single slip. They pointed out that the crime scene had been hopelessly contaminated from day one, and that the so-called new evidence was built on shaky ground. In the end, the jury took only 2 weeks to deliberate. Their verdict: not guilty. Nils Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges, and so the mystery of Lake Bodom remained, unsolved, unresolved, and as chilling as ever. Had the police come full circle only to end where they started? Was Nils truly an innocent man, who had endured a lifetime of trauma, or had justice barely slipped through their fingers? The whispers around the lake continued, and for those who lived nearby, the eerie stillness of those waters had never felt more unnerving. When we talk about unsolved crimes, especially those that have haunted a nation for over half a century, it's important to remember the physical space where the event occurred. Sometimes, the setting speaks in whispers, silent witnesses to things no one lived to explain, and in the case of the Lake Bodom murders, that space was a small patch of forest just off the shore. Imagine standing there in the early morning light. The birds have begun their song again. The water of the lake lies perfectly still, almost like glass, and in that stillness stands a tent, or what remains of it. It's collapsed, sagging under the weight of trauma. Slashes pierce through its canvas like deep claw marks. There are bloodstains not only inside, but also splattered on the exterior, an unsettling detail that would perplex investigators for decades. The tent, in many ways, became the symbol of the case. It was a container of secrets, silent and mutilated, and though it couldn't speak, it offered a kind of forensic diary, if only someone knew how to read it. The location itself was seemingly chosen at random. The teenagers had biked to the lake, and picked a secluded spot on the eastern shore, near the peninsula, that juts into Bodom Järvi. They weren't far from other campers, but far enough that no one would hear what happened next. And that's one of the strangest elements of this story. No one heard a thing. There were people camping nearby, not tens of miles away, but hundreds of meters. 2 boys, fishing on the other side of the lake, reported seeing the tent in the early hours of the morning. A bird watcher was out that morning as well, and he recalled seeing a collapsed tent, but he assumed it had just been taken down. Nobody heard screams. Nobody heard struggling. Nobody even heard the tent being slashed open. It's almost as though the murders occurred in a bubble, a sudden pocket of horror sealed off from the rest of the world. When police began their initial investigation in 1960, they did what most crime scene units would do. Or more accurately, they tried. Unfortunately, the entire process was marred by inexperience and oversight. The crime scene wasn't properly secured. Onlookers, passers-by, and even journalists wandered in and out. Cigarette butts were dropped. The grass was trampled. Evidence was likely handled without gloves. And crucially, the tent itself was moved before all photographs were taken. To make matters worse, many of the photos from the original investigation went missing in the decades that followed. What remained was partial, blurred, incomplete. One of the earliest theories revolved around the idea of a random maniac, a stranger who attacked for no reason. It wasn't an unreasonable idea. After all, stranger-on-stranger violence wasn't unheard of, especially in remote areas. But something about the tent disturbed the detectives. The slashes through the canvas weren't clean. They were furious. More than a dozen stab marks had been driven through from the outside in, which suggested that the attacker had started the assault before even entering the tent. This wasn't just about killing. It was about terror, a deliberate and panicked effort to destroy what was inside. And yet, once inside, the attack had become strangely focused. Of the 3 teenagers who died, Seppo and Anja suffered multiple knife wounds. Mela, however, appeared to be the main target. Her injuries were more severe, more numerous. She had suffered blunt force trauma in addition to stabbing. Some later reports suggest her face had been particularly disfigured, though the full details were kept from the public, likely out of respect for the families. Was this personal? Had the attacker known Mela, or was she simply the most visible in the confusion of the night? That question would remain at the heart of the case, and would lead to countless theories about love triangles, jealousy, and unspoken tensions in the group. One story that surfaced decades later came from a retired officer who had worked the scene in 1960. He claimed that the arrangement of the bodies suggested something ritualistic, that the way Seppo and Anja were found closer together, partially covered, was different from Mela, who was sprawled out more violently. But others dismissed this as over-interpretation. Still, the tent was clear on one thing: the attack was sudden. The group had clearly been sleeping. Their belongings were scattered, but not ransacked. There was no sign of a struggle outside the tent. Their fishing gear was untouched. Their wallets and valuables were still inside. The girls' purses had not been opened. There was no theft, just death. This was not a robbery gone wrong. It was something else. Let's return to a moment that didn't seem important at the time, but later gained traction. Around 6 a.m. on the morning of the murders, a local man and his son reported seeing a blonde-haired man walking away from the lake. He was limping slightly. His clothes looked disheveled. When asked later, they said he was moving with purpose, quickly but not running. Was it Nils? Was it someone else? The man was never found, and over the years, memory plays tricks. Some swore he had long hair, others said it was short. Some said he wore a jacket, others said he was shirtless. Police took the report seriously at the time, but never confirmed the identity. And here's another unsettling detail. Nils' shoes were found far from the tent, not right outside, not neatly placed, but nearly 500 meters away, in different directions, as if they had been flung. One was in the woods, one near the water. Why? If Nils had wandered barefoot in pain, why go in two directions? Had someone taken the shoes and thrown them? Or was it all a red herring? The tent, the shoes, the blood, they formed a chaotic puzzle, but every time someone tried to put it together, it seemed a piece would vanish. Years after the murders, the tent itself was placed into long-term storage. It wasn't displayed, nor was it used for training. It sat in evidence lockers, aging with time. When forensic technology improved, some investigators wondered whether it should be re-examined, but the tent had degraded. Mice had chewed through it in places, stains had spread, mold had formed. Valuable DNA, if it had ever been present, was almost certainly lost. By the time police returned to the scene with new interest in 2004, the tent was no longer helpful. It was just a relic, a ghost of that awful morning. But for all its physical degradation, the image of that tent, sagging, slashed, and surrounded by pine needles, remained deeply embedded in the Finnish psyche. It appeared in newspaper sketches, documentaries, and true crime books. It became a symbol not only of the murders, but of something deeper, the loss of innocence. Finland, in the 1960s, was still adjusting to its post-war identity. Crimes like this just didn't happen, certainly not to happy teenagers on a camping trip. And yet, here was the evidence that they could. That safety was fragile, but the night could still hold danger. For the people of Finland, the tent was more than canvas. It was a wound, and for Nils Gustafsson, whether innocent or not, it was a reminder of a night that would follow him for the rest of his life. Now we'll look closer at the people surrounding the victims, their friends, their families, and the early suspicions that began to creep into the public's mind. How well did anyone really know what happened at Lake Bodom, and who, if anyone, was keeping a secret? It's easy to focus on the violence, on the blood, the tent, the headlines, but behind every true crime story are lives, real people, families left with grief, and survivors left with questions they never wanted to answer. In the aftermath of the Lake Bodom murders, Finland was not just shocked, it was unprepared, and nowhere was that more evident than in the way people began to treat the sole survivor, Nils Gustafsson. At just 18 years old, Nils emerged from the wreckage of that morning, not just injured, but disoriented and alone. His girlfriend had been murdered beside him, his friends lay dead just feet away, and for decades, many believed he too had nearly died that night, but others weren't so sure. Let's go back to where it all began, before the tent, before the crime scene, to try and understand the relationships and subtle tensions that might hold hidden answers. Teenagers on holiday. The trip to Lake Bodom was by all accounts spontaneous. It was early summer, school was nearly over.
The days were long, and like many teenagers, they simply wanted to enjoy the fresh air and freedom of youth. Seppo Boisman and Nils Gustafsson were friends, close friends. They were both outgoing, social, and energetic, described by classmates as cheerful and popular. The girls, Mala Emeli Björklund and Anja Tulikki Meki, were also friends, though quieter. Mala was Nils's girlfriend, Anja was dating Seppo. They were all from Espoo, a city just west of Helsinki. Life in the 1960s was simpler in many ways. Social media, no cell phones, no digital footprints, but it also meant that when people vanished, there wasn't much left behind to retrace their steps. According to surviving records and interviews, the group had packed light, tents, sleeping bags, fishing gear, a small radio. No alcohol was confirmed at the scene, though rumors of drinking persisted. They biked to the lake and picked their spot, Eastern Shore, near a shallow peninsula, secluded, but not entirely isolated. They were last seen alive around 10:30 p.m. on June 4th by a local fisherman. He noted them laughing, relaxing, nothing seemed unusual, and that's where the mystery deepens, because from that moment on, no one knows for certain what happened. The parents and the panic. When the bodies were discovered by passers-by the next morning, panic spread quickly. The police were called, parents were notified, and almost immediately, questions began swirling. Who would attack teenagers sleeping in a tent? Why had only one survived? And perhaps most disturbingly, why didn't anyone hear anything? For the families, the grief was paralyzing. Seppo's parents reportedly refused to speak to the press. Mala's mother fainted upon hearing the news. Finland was a small country at the time, communities were tight-knit, and these weren't troubled teens. They were considered good kids, polite, respectful, hopeful about the future. In the days that followed, the funerals were held quietly. Mala's service was said to be particularly somber, with classmates lining the street in silence. Nils, still in the hospital, could not attend. He was recovering from a broken jaw, a concussion, and multiple facial injuries. His wounds were real, documented and photographed. For years these injuries seemed to confirm what the police believed, that Nils was a victim, not a suspect. But as time passed, memories blurred, whispers started, and people began to ask, could the story be more complicated? A memory full of holes. One of the key challenges for investigators was that Nils's memory of the night was fragmented. He claimed to remember going to sleep, then waking up in pain, confusion and chaos. He did not recall seeing the attacker. He didn't remember the slashing of the tent or the sounds of his friends screaming. He was simply hurt, disoriented, bleeding, possibly concussed, and in that vacuum of memory, theories grew. Some believed that Nils might have stepped outside in the night, perhaps to relieve himself, and then encountered someone, or something that started a confrontation. Others wondered whether a fight had broken out among the group itself. Perhaps jealousy, or a heated argument, had turned into violence. Maybe someone had snapped. The police interviewed dozens of people in the weeks that followed. Friends, neighbors, classmates. Most described the four teenagers as friendly, easygoing, and drama-free. But teenage relationships are complex, often hidden behind smiles and unspoken feelings. A few murmurs surfaced. One classmate claimed Nils and Seppo had a brief argument at school weeks earlier. Another said that Nils had once been possessive over Mela, but nothing conclusive. No red flags, just the usual entanglements of teenage emotions. Still, for some detectives, it was enough to wonder. Suspect in the mirror. What complicates this case further is how it evolved over time. For decades, police maintained that the attacker was unknown, possibly a vagrant, a local farmer, or even a foreigner passing through. The case went cold, but in 2004, 44 years later, the Finnish police reopened it, and in a stunning twist, they arrested Nils Gustafsson, yes, the survivor, the boy who had been hospitalized, the man who had lived with the trauma, for nearly half a century. Why? Well, by 2004, forensic science had advanced. Police re-examined the blood evidence from the tent. They studied the injuries more closely. They argued that Nils's wounds were less severe than previously thought, and that his broken jaw could have resulted from a fistfight, not a blunt weapon. Their theory was simple, but shocking. Nils and Seppo had gotten into an argument, possibly about the girls. The fight escalated. Nils, in a rage, killed the others. Then, to cover it up, he injured himself and staged the scene to look like an outside attack. To many, it sounded far-fetched, but prosecutors pursued it. Nils was charged with 3 counts of murder. The trial of the century in 2005. Finland watched as the Lake Bodom murders returned to the headlines. Nils Gustafsson, now in his 60s, stood trial for the deaths of his closest friends. It was surreal. The man had built a life after the murders, worked in transportation, married, lived quietly, and now, nearly half a century later, he faced the possibility of life in prison. The trial was a media spectacle. Reporters from all over Europe arrived. Courtroom sketches filled the newspapers, and yet the case still lacked a smoking gun. There was no confession, no new witness, just a reinterpretation of old evidence. The defense argued that the police had botched the original investigation so badly that no theory could be trusted. They emphasized the lack of motive. They brought in experts who argued that Nils's injuries were consistent with a brutal attack, not self-inflicted. In the end, the jury agreed. Nils Gustafsson was acquitted. He left the courtroom a free man, but not a man without scars. A nation divided even after the trial. Public opinion in Finland remained divided. Some believed Nils had gotten away with murder. Others believed he had been wrongly accused for a second time, the first by the killer, the second by the state. The case remains unsolved, and though DNA evidence had improved, no usable genetic material was recovered from the scene that could be matched to any known individual. Whoever committed the murders, if not Nils, had vanished like mist over the lake. To this day, the case divides families. Online forums still debate every detail. Amateur sleuths pore over diagrams of the tent, theories about timelines, maps of the forest, but no one has found a definitive answer. It remains a mystery, one made all the more haunting because of its simplicity. 4 teenagers went camping, 3 never came back, and 1 returned with a story full of shadows. We'll begin exploring the key suspects that emerged outside of Nils Gustafsson. Some were locals, some were strangers, and 1 even confessed more than once. Could any of them have been the real killer, or were they simply distractions from a darker truth?
Even after the dust of the trial had settled and Nils Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges, the central question lingered. If not him, then who? The Lake Bodom murders remain one of Finland's greatest unsolved crimes, but that doesn't mean there was a shortage of suspects. In fact, over the years, investigators explored dozens of leads. Some were dead ends, some were dead men, and some were far more disturbing. Today, we'll explore those possible culprits, the outsiders, the wanderers, the men who were close enough to kill, but just far enough to slip away into the forest. Because somewhere in the shadows of Lake Bodom's shoreline, someone walked away from a massacre. The man in the marsh. In the earliest days of the investigation, before the scene had even been fully sealed, people began to whisper about a stranger. A man had been seen walking near the lake in the early morning hours, wet from the knees down, barefoot, and strangely calm. Some claimed he had blood on his clothes. Others remembered only that he moved awkwardly, almost limping. He was never identified. Police scoured the nearby homes and villages for anyone matching the description, but no one came forward. In a time before widespread surveillance, before cameras on every phone and street corner, a person could simply disappear, especially in the countryside. This nameless, faceless man would be the first in a long line of phantoms. The press called him the Marsh Stranger, a ghost in human form. But whether he was truly there, or just a product of collective panic, is something we'll never know. Hans Assmann, the enigmatic German. Of all the names that have surfaced in this case, Hans Assmann is perhaps the most infamous. He was a German national living in Finland during the 1960s. A tall, elegant man with a murky past. Some claimed he had ties to the KGB or the Stasi. Others whispered he had once been a Nazi or a post-war agent. What is certain is that he had worked at Helsinki's University Hospital and had a reputation for being peculiar. On the morning after the murders, June 5, 1960, Assmann showed up at that very hospital, behaving oddly. He was disheveled. His clothes were stained, possibly with blood. His hands were dirty, and his demeanor agitated. Nurses recalled that he was evasive when questioned, and appeared to be pretending to be unconscious. When doctors examined him, he suddenly leapt up and stormed out. Even stranger, the police were never called. At that time, Assmann was not a known suspect, and the hospital staff had no reason to detain him. Years later, a former detective would claim that Assmann had been interviewed about the Lake Bodom case, but that the investigation was shut down from above, perhaps due to his alleged connections with intelligence agencies. When Assmann died in 1998, a swirl of conspiracy followed. A journalist named Jorma Palo insisted the man had confessed on his deathbed to being involved in the murders, though Palo was vague, offering no recordings or signed statements. Still, many believe Assmann was the killer. Why? The timing, the behavior, the location, but most of all, the silence. He was never officially charged, never publicly cleared, just another shadow cast across the lake. The kiosk owner, with a knife. Another lesser-known suspect was a man named Pentti Soininen. Soininen had a troubled history, petty crimes, domestic abuse, and a known dislike for teenagers. He was from the area and had reportedly been near the lake around the time of the murders. He also had a reputation for violence and a deep lingering paranoia. Sometime after the killings, Soininen was arrested for an unrelated crime and began talking, rambling, some said, about the Lake Bodom murders. He claimed to have information. He claimed to know things that hadn't been made public. And at one point, he even claimed he was there. But as quickly as the leads emerged, they vanished. Soininen later retracted his statements, calling them a misunderstanding. Some speculated he was lying for attention. Others thought he may have been mentally unstable, confusing dreams or stories with reality. Regardless, he remained on the suspect list for years, but no hard evidence ever linked him to the scene. And when he died in the early 1990s, another potential thread of truth was buried with him. The boy on the bicycle. Sometimes, what seems innocent can take on darker meaning in hindsight. Around the time of the murders, several witnesses reported seeing a young man on a bicycle riding near the campsite in the evening hours. He wasn't part of the group of that they were sure, but he circled the area, watched for a while and then rode off. Some thought he was just curious. Others wondered if he had been scouting the campsite, waiting for the right moment. The boy was never identified, and years later, that detail, the bicycle, the glances, the silence, took on a new weight, because if he wasn't connected, then who was he? And if he was innocent, why didn't he come forward when the murders became national news? The local farmers and the hermit throughout the investigation. Dozens of locals were interviewed. Farmers, fishers, woodsmen, anyone who might have been nearby that weekend. Some had heard nothing. Some claimed to have seen flashlights in the woods. Others believed a hermit living in the forest could have been involved. This unnamed recluse was described by some as eccentric, possibly disturbed. He lived alone in a makeshift shelter deep in the woods, and rarely spoke to anyone. Police found him, questioned him, and moved on. There was no evidence, no connection, no reason to suspect him beyond proximity and lifestyle. But it's a reminder that the lake was not as isolated as people assumed. Paths crossed, stories blurred, and in the absence of answers, suspicion filled the silence. An accidental killing. There's also a theory, one whispered among former detectives, that the murders were not premeditated at all. That someone, maybe a poacher, a hunter, or a local with a grudge, stumbled upon the teenagers, and something went wrong. A confrontation, a fight. Maybe they were told to leave or quiet down, and refused. Maybe someone was armed and panicked. The brutality of the attack doesn't necessarily suggest planning. In fact, it might suggest rage, chaos, a moment spiraling out of control. But if that were true, why no confessions? Why no rumors in the bars, or letters, or deathbed truths? Even crimes of passion often leave trails. The Lake Bodom murders left almost none. The ghost stories over the decades, as the evidence faded and the facts blurred, the Lake Bodom case took on a folkloric air. People told ghost stories by the lake. Teenagers dared one another to camp near the site. Some said the forest was cursed. Others claimed to see strange figures in the woods at night. A few insisted the killer was not human at all, but a spirit, forever tied to the waters. These tales may seem fanciful, but they speak to something deeper, a need to explain the unexplainable. When justice is absent, imagination fills the void. A crime that refuses to die today, the Lake Bodom murders are still taught in Finnish criminology courses. Students analyze the evidence. Journalists revisit the timeline. And tourists visit the lake, often unaware of the horror that once took place by its shores. There's even a horror film inspired by the case, though it takes creative liberties, transforming real tragedy into entertainment. What remains, though, is a simple truth. 3 young lives were cut short. 1 survived, and someone, whether a stranger, a friend or a ghost, walked away unseen. The early morning light of June 5, 1960, washed over a crime scene that had already been altered. Bodies had been moved. A tent slashed open by a blade now fluttered in the breeze, like a flag of warning. The surviving boy had been taken to the hospital, and well-meaning townsfolk, police officers, and even reporters had wandered through the site in their confusion. And yet, amidst the chaos and the questions, the forest still whispered hints of what had happened. Quiet hints, incomplete hints, pieces of a puzzle that even now remains unfinished. Tonight we return to that campsite, not to relive the horror, but to carefully walk through what was found, what wasn't, and what it might still be trying to say. Because sometimes, the silence of a scene can be as loud as a scream. The scene itself. The first thing to note is that the murder site was not as remote as many assume. Lake Bodom was popular with campers. There were trails, bike paths, and small fishing spots. On that June morning, the tent stood just meters from the water, among thin trees and uneven ground. When the first adults arrived, 2 bird watchers, who spotted the collapsed tent, they didn't immediately realize what they were seeing. The tent had been slashed from the outside. It had collapsed inward, blood soaked the fabric and pooled on the grass. At first, it might have looked like a hunting accident, or a strange mishap. But soon the bodies were found. Mela Amelie Björklund lay partially outside the tent. She had clearly suffered the worst of the attack. Her body was bruised, stabbed, and beaten. It was later confirmed that she had been the only one pulled out of the tent entirely. Some speculated this meant the killer had focused on her. Others thought she might have tried to escape and been dragged back. Anja Tuliki Meki and Seppo Antero Boisman were still inside the tent, entangled in blood and fabric. They too had been struck and stabbed multiple times. The extent of the violence was staggering. Only Nils Gustafsson, the surviving boy, was found alive though badly injured. He was discovered lying some distance away, closer to the edge of the woods. His jaw was broken, his face swollen, his shoes were missing, and around them the quiet forest stood still. The murder weapons that weren't found. One of the most chilling elements of the case is that the murder weapons were never recovered. The attacker had used both a knife and a blunt object, likely a heavy rock or a metal pipe. This dual weapon approach was unusual. Most crimes involve a single weapon, something quick, or something available in the moment. But here the attacker had used both stabbing and bludgeoning. That suggested either they came prepared, or they adapted quickly and savagely. The tent had been cut from the outside. That's a crucial detail. It means the victims were attacked as they slept. They never saw it coming. And yet, no knife, not even the kind a camper might carry, was found nearby. No bloody rock or weapon was located in the woods or lake. Whoever did this
had the foresight to take the tools of death with them? And if that person was acting in blind rage, how did they stay calm enough to clean up afterward? It's one of many contradictions in this case. The missing shoes of all the forensic oddities, perhaps the strangest was the disappearance, and later recovery, of Nils Gustafsson's shoes. At first, police believed the killer had taken them. Or maybe they'd been lost in a struggle. It made little sense. But then, days after the murder, Nils's bloodied shoes were found, hidden nearly a kilometer away. Why? Why would someone move a victim's shoes so far from the scene? Some thought it was an attempt to confuse investigators. Others suggested it pointed to Gustafsson himself, perhaps staging something. But that theory has its limits. If he were the killer, why leave the shoes where they could be found? The more likely explanation is that the killer took them deliberately, maybe to mislead police, or to avoid leaving footprints, and then discarded them later. But again, that requires a level of planning, or calm, that seems at odds with the brutality of the crime. Whoever did this wasn't just violent. They were clever. Fingerprints, fibers and forensics. Here's where we enter the limitations of 1960s science. Today, a scene like Lake Bodom would be swabbed, scanned, and analyzed with advanced tools. DNA would be lifted from tent poles, footprints captured digitally, blood spatter analyzed with 3D imaging. But in 1960 Finland, forensics were still relatively basic. There were no usable fingerprints lifted from the tent or surrounding objects. That could mean gloves were worn, or the prints were smudged by the flood of visitors after the discovery. There were no foreign hairs or fibers conclusively linked to a stranger. Blood typing was done, but with limited results. All the blood found at the scene matched the victims or the survivor. There were no cigarette butts, no food scraps, no bottles, nothing to suggest a killer lingered. If anything, it looked like the attack had been fast, targeted and deliberately clean. The timeline that didn't add up according to the surviving boy, Gustafsson. The group had gone to sleep shortly after midnight. They had been drinking a little, laughing, listening to the lake. Sometime between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., the killer attacked. But here's the odd part. Nearby witnesses, people camping or walking in the early morning hours, reported seeing strange movements at the campsite just before sunrise. A light flickering, a shadow walking toward the trees. One man swore he saw someone on a bicycle, looking back toward the lake. Those moments may hold the truth of the timeline. But without video or photos, all we have are memories, and memory is a tricky thing, especially after decades. The weather's role. One detail often forgotten in retellings is that the morning after the murders brought light rain. This rainfall may have destroyed or degraded some of the evidence, footprints for example, or traced blood droplets away from the tent. If the killer had tracked blood through the woods, those prints were likely washed away by the time police properly surveyed the wider area. In a way, the weather protected the killer. Even nature seemed to close around the crime, sealing it. Modern forensic attempts. In 2004, Finnish authorities reopened the case, this time with the benefit of DNA technology. They tested blood samples stored for over 40 years. They examined the shoes, the tent, the remaining clothing, and what they found was complex. Traces of Gustafsson's blood were found inside the tent and on the victims. That was expected. He had been injured, but notably, his blood was not found on the outside of the tent, where the killer would have needed to be. Prosecutors claimed this suggested he wasn't outside attacking, but rather inside being attacked. It was one of the key arguments used during his 2005 trial. But as we now know, that case ended in acquittal, and the DNA didn't point to any other suspect either. No unknown profile, no genetic clue. Despite decades of technological progress, the evidence remained eerily silent, a scene frozen in time today. If you visit Lake Bodom, you'll find a serene and beautiful place. The trees sway gently, the water laps quietly at the shore, the birds call out across the sky. You wouldn't know that anything ever happened there. There's no plaque, no memorial, just the soft ground where a tent once stood, and lives were forever changed. Some say it's disrespectful that the spot isn't marked. Others believe the silence is appropriate, that it honors the mystery. But either way, the forensic record of that night is all we have, and it tells a story that is both clear and clouded. A story where someone came to a lakeside camp with darkness in their heart, and left without a trace. The year was 1960. Finland was still finding its rhythm after the turbulence of World War II. Helsinki was growing, modernizing, and yet in the rural towns and forested edges, like those around Espoo and the shores of Lake Bodom, life still moved slowly, peacefully, until the murders, the slaughter of 3 teenagers, and the mysterious survival of a 4th wasn't just a tragedy, it was an anomaly. Finland didn't have crimes like this. People didn't get murdered in their tents while camping. The quiet lakeside became the epicenter of something unthinkable. And suddenly, the nation was looking for answers. Tonight we turn to those who tried to find them. The police, the first responders, the lead investigators, and the mounting list of questions they faced. The first police on the scene. By the time the police arrived at the Lake Bodom crime scene on the morning of June 5th, the area had already been compromised. Before them, the bird watchers had seen the collapsed tent and gone closer to investigate. Then local passers-by, perhaps drawn by curiosity, had approached. Some even tried to help before realizing the horror they were standing in. As a result, footprints were trampled, potential evidence was moved, and any fresh impressions in the soil were likely destroyed. Still, the initial police officers did what they could. They secured the site, marked the positions of the bodies, and began asking questions. But the crime scene work was, by today's standards, quite basic. Photos were taken, yes, but there was no cordoning off the perimeter with tape. No gloves. No evidence markers. The bodies of the victims were removed fairly quickly, again standard at the time, but problematic for forensic analysis. And that meant that from the very beginning, the detectives assigned to the case were working with a blurred picture. Enter Detective Chief Inspector Kärkkäinen. The man assigned to lead the investigation was Detective Chief Inspector Matti Kärkkäinen, an experienced officer from the National Bureau of Investigation. He was calm, methodical, and not prone to dramatics. But even he knew this case was different. 3 teenagers dead, 1 survivor, no weapon, no suspect, no clear motive. Kärkkäinen began with the basics. He ordered interviews with friends and family of the victims. He had Nils Gustafsson questioned at the hospital when his condition allowed, and he directed officers to search the area for the missing weapons and any signs of a break-in or stalking. But the lake area offered nothing. No weapon was found. No blood trails. No clothing. No dropped belongings from a possible attacker. It was as if the killer had vanished. The early suspects, despite the lack of physical evidence, the public pressure was immense. Newspapers covered the murders daily. Rumors spread. Was it a local woodsman? A jealous lover? A foreign tourist? The first major theory that emerged was a crime of passion. Some believed the killer had targeted the group due to a personal grudge, perhaps even a romantic triangle involving one of the girls. But this was quickly dismissed by family and friends, who confirmed there was no drama between the teens. Another early suspect was a mentally ill man who had been seen walking near the lake shortly before the murders. But he had no history of violence, and no evidence placed him at the scene. There were even whispers that the killer might have come from outside Finland, a traveler, a drifter, or even a Soviet agent, in an era still haunted by Cold War paranoia. Detective Kärkkäinen chased every lead. He was known for his patience and thoroughness. But by the end of that summer, he faced a grim reality. He had no suspect. A flood of confessions in the months following the murders. Something strange began to happen. The police received dozens of false confessions. Some were from people suffering from delusions or mental illness. Others seemed to be attention seekers. One man claimed to have been possessed at the time. Another sent a letter claiming he was a servant of death, but offered no details about the crime. These confessions wasted time and energy. Still, Kärkanen investigated each one. He knew that in some crimes, especially brutal ones, the perpetrator might come forward in a twisted attempt at attention or redemption, but none of these confessions held up under scrutiny. The timelines didn't match. The details were wrong. The alibis were solid. It became a pattern, noise without signal. And the real killer stayed quiet. Was it someone they knew? Another theory began to take shape within the investigative team. What if the killer was someone known to the victims? The fact that the attack was so violent, so personal, suggested rage. It wasn't a simple robbery. Nothing had been stolen. It wasn't a random act of terror. No other campers nearby had been harmed. It was specific, focused. Investigators revisited the victims' social circles. They looked into school records, questioned acquaintances, even asked about any jealous classmates or neighbors with grudges. Again they found nothing. Mela Björklund was described as shy and kind. Anja Mecki, sweet and thoughtful. Seppo Boisman was quiet but protective. No enemies, no vendettas. The theory faded, and with it, the momentum of the case. The survivor. A question without an answer. With no external suspects gaining traction, a quiet, controversial question began to arise among some officers. Could Nils Gustafsson have done it? It was a difficult idea to entertain. He had suffered a broken jaw, a concussion, and multiple bruises. He was found lying unconscious and bloodied, several meters from the tent, but there were inconsistencies in his statements. Initially, Gustafsson claimed he didn't remember the attack. Later he recalled glimpses, a shadowy figure, a hand reaching into the tent, the feeling of pain and confusion. Some of his injuries, doctors later speculated, could have been self-inflicted, or the result of a staged fight. Still, there was no evidence tying him to the murder weapons. And crucially, if he had killed his friends, why would he mutilate himself so severely? Why would he lie down in the cold forest, unconscious and vulnerable? The theory seemed thin. Even Kärkanen, who considered all possibilities, reportedly did not believe Gustafsson was guilty. And so the case moved in circles. International help. In the mid-1960s, the Finnish authorities quietly sought assistance from foreign experts. Criminologists from Germany and Sweden reviewed the case file. A psychological profiler was brought in to try and map out the kind of person who might commit such a crime. The profile suggested someone male, young, possibly a loner, with a fascination for knives. But it offered no name, no face. The forest remained silent. And as the years passed, so too did many of the original investigators. Kärkanen eventually retired, reportedly still haunted by the case. He once told a reporter that it was the one that never let go. Why the case went cold. To understand why the Lake Bodom murders remained unsolved, we must accept a sobering truth. Time is not kind to evidence. Witness memories fade. Physical clues degrade. The forest reclaims its secrets. And in 1960, forensic science simply wasn't equipped to handle what modern tools might now solve. But even with today's technology, this case presents a chilling possibility. That the killer was someone ordinary, someone local, someone who never spoke, never bragged, never confessed, someone who walked away into the woods and kept walking. More than 4 decades passed after that terrible morning at Lake Bodom. The pine trees aged quietly along the shoreline. New generations came and went. The memory of the murders never fully left the public's mind, but they faded into the background, an unsolved chapter of Finnish history, strange and unsettling. And then in 2004, that chapter suddenly reopened. The reason? A shocking decision by Finnish authorities. After years of silence, they announced that they were charging the sole survivor of the attack, Nils Gustafsson, with the murders of his 3 friends. It was a move that would divide the nation, puzzle international observers, and put a very old case back in the spotlight. So how did we get here? Let's trace the story. A case reawakened in the early 2000s, Finland. like much of the world, was undergoing a quiet revolution in forensic science. DNA testing had become more precise, more affordable, and more powerful. Cold cases, long thought unsolvable, were now being re-examined. Among those reopened cases was Lake Bodom. New forensic experts were brought in, old evidence was reanalyzed, items of clothing, tent fabric, and the blood traces on various objects from the scene were subjected to modern DNA techniques. And slowly, a new theory emerged. Authorities claimed that the blood patterns and injuries suggested that Nils Gustafsson was not a victim, but the perpetrator. The National Bureau of Investigation now believed that an alcohol-fueled fight had broken out at the campsite, a fight between Nils and Seppo, possibly over one of the girls. According to this theory, it escalated into violence, and in a sudden fit of rage, Gustafsson attacked and killed all three of his companions. Then, to cover his tracks, he injured himself and staged the scene. The arrest in March of 2004. Nils Gustafsson, now 62 years old, was arrested at his home. He was no longer the teenager lying bloodied near a collapsed tent. He was a retired bus driver with a family and grandchildren. His arrest shocked the country. Why now? Why so long after the fact? Police pointed to new blood evidence that had been analyzed in recent years. According to their forensic experts, Gustafsson's shoe, found partly buried near the scene, contained the blood of all three victims, but not his own. That, they argued, suggested the shoe had been worn during the killings, but removed before he inflicted wounds upon himself. It was a chilling theory, but it would be up to a court to decide whether it held weight. Preparing for trial. The Finnish legal system moved carefully. This was not just a cold case. It was the most notorious unsolved murder in Finnish history. The case file was enormous, filled with decades of reports, conflicting statements, false leads and rumors. The prosecutors had to build a clear, logical timeline of what they believed happened. Their theory went like this. The group had consumed alcohol on the night of June 4, 1960. Nils Gustafsson and Seppo Boisman, both 18 at the time, got into an argument, possibly over Seppo's girlfriend Mela. The fight turned physical. Gustafsson lost the fight. He received facial injuries early, and in a rage retrieved a knife and/or blunt object, attacking the others as they slept or tried to flee. After the murders, he inflicted further injuries on himself, tossed his shoe, and staged the scene to appear as though he'd been attacked too. It was a neat theory, but theories need proof, and the defense was ready. The trial begins in August of 2000. Nils Gustafsson stood trial in the district court of Espoo. It was a surreal moment for many Finns. The quiet survivor of one of the country's darkest crimes was now being accused of causing that crime. The courtroom was tense, but calm. No shouting, no drama. This was Finland, after all. But emotions ran deep. The prosecution presented their DNA evidence and forensic conclusions. They showed diagrams of the blood-stained tent, photographs from 1960, and reports from the modern analysis team. They emphasized Gustafsson's alleged motive, jealousy and rage. They argued that only he had the opportunity. They claimed his story had changed over time. First he remembered nothing. Later he offered fragments. Was that because he was hiding something? But the defense struck back. They called multiple independent experts to testify that the blood evidence was inconclusive. Yes, Gustafsson's shoe had blood on it, but that wasn't surprising. He'd been at the scene. He'd been injured. He'd lain in the grass just meters from the others. And what of his injuries? Doctors confirmed that his jaw had been fractured, possibly by a blow. He had a concussion, and multiple bruises consistent with defensive wounds. Why would someone inflict that on themselves, then lie unconscious for hours in the forest? The defense suggested something else. The investigators were trying to force a solution to a case that had haunted them for decades. With no better suspects and mounting pressure to bring closure, they had turned on the only person left. A divided nation. As the trial unfolded, the public was deeply divided. Some were convinced Gustafsson was guilty. Others believed he was being scapegoated. A man who had lost his friends, now forced to relive the worst night of his life while being accused of causing it. And then after weeks of testimony, exhibits and expert debate, the court reached its decision. In October 2005, Nils Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges. The court found that there was not enough evidence to prove he was the killer beyond a reasonable doubt. The blood evidence was not definitive. The motive was speculative, and the injuries he sustained were considered significant and consistent with a real attack. Gustafsson was free, but the mystery remained.
Aftermath following the trial, Gustafsson largely disappeared from public life. He gave a few interviews, brief, polite, but guarded. He maintained his innocence and expressed sorrow for the loss of his friends. He said he had been through something most people could never understand, and then had to relive it, in court, 4 decades later. The trial left a mark on Finland. For some it closed a chapter. For others it deepened the mystery. Because if Nils didn't do it, who did? And why? The acquittal of Nils Gustafsson in 2005 may have settled the question of his innocence in the eyes of the Finnish courts. But it did little to soothe the deep mystery that still lingered over Lake Bodom. If he didn't commit the murders, then who did? And perhaps more unsettling, why were there so many strange accounts, coincidences, and missed leads in this case? The truth is, from the very beginning, the Lake Bodom investigation was plagued not only by a lack of evidence, but by too many possibilities. Over the decades, a parade of suspects would emerge, some plausible, others strange, and a few deeply disturbing. In this part, we'll walk through the most prominent alternative theories and examine the key figures whose names have been tied, however loosely, to this enduring mystery. Let's begin with one of the strangest. The strange man in black. In the days leading up to the murders, multiple people visiting the area around Lake Bodom recalled seeing a mysterious man wandering the woods nearby. He was described as wearing dark clothing, often walking with purpose, but without a fishing rod, camping gear, or any sign he was there for leisure. He seemed to be watching people. Some accounts said he was tall, possibly military in bearing, with a stony face and piercing eyes. Could he have been simply a hiker, a drifter, or something else entirely? The man in black was never identified. He left no trace behind, just a handful of uncomfortable memories. One family recalled seeing him walking the perimeter of the lake, staring across the water at the tents in the distance. Another couple swore he was following them through the forest until they turned to confront him, and he vanished into the trees. After the murders, investigators tried to locate this man, but no leads surfaced. He remains one of the earliest and eeriest figures tied to the case. Hans Assmann, the Cold War enigma. Perhaps the most widely discussed alternative suspect in the Lake Bodom murders is a man named Hans Assmann, and his story is stranger than fiction. Assmann was a German-born man living in Finland during the 1960s. He was known to be reclusive, intense, and secretive. Whispers followed him everywhere, whispers that he had been a spy during World War II, or possibly a KGB agent after the war. He spoke multiple languages fluently, and often acted like a man with something to hide. But why was he tied to the Lake Bodom murders? It wasn't his background, it was what happened the day after the killings. On June 5, 1960, Hans Assmann reportedly showed up at a hospital in Helsinki. He had blood on his clothes, his fingernails were black, and his appearance was described as nervous, agitated, and evasive. He tried to hide his face, refused to answer questions, and insisted he be treated quickly. Hospital staff found his behavior odd, disturbingly so. They also noticed something else. Despite being covered in blood, he had no injuries. None. When police were informed, they reportedly dismissed the connection to the murders, saying Assmann had a strong alibi. But what that alibi was, and how it was confirmed, remains vague. The records are unclear. Some say the authorities didn't want to cause a panic by linking a spy to a local crime. Others believe Assmann may have manipulated his way out of trouble. Later in life, he was reportedly overheard confessing to the murders, though he never did so publicly. One former police officer swore that Assmann told him the full story, how the killings happened, what the motive was, and why it would never be solved. Of course, it was never proven. Assmann died in 1998, taking his secrets to the grave. But to this day, many believe he was the key to the mystery. The local farmer. Another name that surfaces in the tangle of theories is that of a local farmer, known to have lived not far from Lake Bodom. There's no conclusive evidence tying him to the crime, but according to some accounts, he had a history of mental illness, a deep resentment of tourists and teenagers, and had once been caught harassing campers in the area. Years after the murders, he reportedly made disturbing comments about what happens to young people who trespass. Police did question him, but ultimately found no grounds to pursue charges. Still, some locals whispered that he knew more than he ever said. He died before DNA testing could be applied to any evidence connected to him, and so, like many others, he faded into legend. The revenge theory. One theory proposed over the years has been that the murders were an act of revenge, not random violence, not a crime of passion, but deliberate retribution. Some have speculated that Seppo Boisman, one of the boys killed, may have gotten into trouble with someone older, perhaps due to a romantic relationship or a personal debt. Could someone have followed the group to Lake Bodom, waited until nightfall, and taken their vengeance? The idea is both chilling and tantalizing, but it relies entirely on speculation. There's no concrete evidence that Seppo or the others were involved in any dangerous disputes before the trip. Still, in the absence of answers, this theory remains in circulation among amateur sleuths: a wandering killer. There's another possibility too, one that's often overlooked. What if the killer wasn't from the area at all? Finland in the 1960s had limited access across borders, but vagrants, travelers and nomads still moved through Europe quietly. Some committed crimes, some were never caught. In several other countries, Germany, Sweden, and even France, unsolved stabbings in campsites or isolated woods bear similarities to what happened at Lake Bodom. Could it have been the work of a serial killer, unknown to the police, who passed through, struck, and disappeared? It's possible. But again, no hard evidence has ever surfaced to link Lake Bodom to any other murder, only haunting similarities. Theories that refuse to die. What's most remarkable about the Lake Bodom case is the endurance of the speculation. Unlike many cold cases, this one remains fresh in the Finnish consciousness. Books, films, songs, and documentaries have kept it alive. Each new generation discovers the story and asks the same question: how could this happen? And no one be held accountable. To this day, people visit the site where the murders occurred. Some go out of curiosity, others to pay their respects. Still others, particularly those interested in the paranormal, claim the area is haunted, that the trees remember, that the wind near the lake carries the echoes of that terrible night. There is a simple cross near the site, quietly marking the memory of the 3 teenagers who died there. It stands in silence, surrounded by trees, but the silence speaks volumes. The Lake Bodom murders did not just fade into history as a cold case. Instead, they seeped deeply into the cultural fabric of Finland, leaving a mark that has lasted for decades. This tragedy stirred a profound and lingering fear, creating a sense of unease about the wilderness, the quiet forests, and the lonely lakes that many Finns hold dear. Fear of the woods. Finland is a country famous for its vast forests and thousands of lakes, places of beauty, solitude and escape. But after June 1960, the forests around Lake Bodom became in some ways a symbol of danger. For many parents, the idea of teenagers camping alone by the lake took on new, darker meaning. It reminded everyone that even the most peaceful places can hide terrible secrets. Local police saw a spike in reports of suspicious figures and strange noises near campsites in the years following the murders. Whether these reports were real or products of fear is unclear, but the atmosphere of suspicion was undeniable. Music inspired by mystery. The dark legacy of Lake Bodom has even made its way into the world of music. In the late 1990s, a Finnish heavy metal band named Children of Bodom formed, inspired by the story of the murders. Their music combined aggressive metal riffs with eerie, haunting melodies, perfectly capturing the chilling aura surrounding the lake. Songs like Lake Bodom and Bodom After Midnight pay direct homage to the case,
intertwining fact and legend in lyrics that send a shiver down the spine. Children of Bodom gained international fame, and their connection to the murders introduced the story to listeners worldwide, ensuring that the mystery continued to spread beyond Finland's borders. Urban legends and paranormal tales. The Lake Bodom murders have also spawned numerous urban legends and ghost stories. Some say the spirits of the victims haunt the woods, wandering the same paths they once walked. Visitors to the site have reported strange lights, eerie sounds, and an unsettling feeling of being watched. One legend tells of a shadowy figure seen standing by the water's edge at night, disappearing whenever approached. Whether these tales come from a genuine paranormal experience, or the human need to make sense of tragedy, they have helped keep the story alive. Passed down through generations. Impact on Finnish society beyond fear and folklore. The murders prompted real changes in how Finnish society viewed safety and policing. Camping became less common among youth for a time, and parents became more protective. Police investigations evolved, with new forensic techniques being developed and applied in later years, partly inspired by the frustrations of the Bodom case. Schools occasionally used the story to warn students about safety, a grim reminder of vulnerability, even in nature. Film and literature. The case has been retold many times, both in documentaries and fictionalized works. Books dissect every known detail, offering theories and speculations. Films, sometimes sensationalized, bring the story to life on screen, blending horror, mystery, and tragedy. Each retelling adds another layer to the mythos surrounding Lake Bodom, feeding public fascination. The enduring mystery. Through all these cultural echoes, the core question remains: who killed the 3 teenagers at Lake Bodom? Why was one left alive, but forever haunted? And why has justice remained elusive for more than half a century? The lake, the forest, the cross, all stand as silent witnesses. The murders may be decades old, but the questions linger, and for many the shadow of Lake Bodom still looms large in the mind. As the decades passed, forensic science advanced rapidly, transforming how investigators approached cold cases like the Lake Bodom murders. What once was impossible to analyze became within reach thanks to new techniques and technologies. In the early 2000s, Finnish police reopened the investigation with renewed vigor, spurred by advances in DNA analysis that promised fresh clues from old evidence. Re-examining the crime scene, the original physical evidence, preserved for decades, was meticulously reviewed. Items collected from the scene, such as clothing, weapons and other materials, were subjected to modern forensic testing. The hope was to find traces of DNA or other biological evidence that might identify the killer beyond doubt. This approach was groundbreaking at the time. Cold cases rarely saw such scientific scrutiny. DNA evidence, and the police suspect one of the most important developments was the discovery of DNA on the victims' clothing. The DNA did not match any of the victims or known individuals related to them. This discovery fueled suspicions and theories, but frustratingly, did not yield an immediate identification. In 2005, a man named Nils Gustafsson, who had been a prime suspect back in the 1960s, was cleared through DNA evidence. This left the police searching for new leads, new suspects and theories. The reopening of the case led to speculation about other suspects. Some investigators considered whether the attack was random or targeted. Others believed a local with deep knowledge of the area was involved, possibly someone who knew the victims. Despite extensive investigation, no suspect was definitively linked to the crime through forensic means. Challenges of cold case forensics. Investigators faced several challenges. The evidence had aged, potentially degrading over time. Contamination from early handling methods complicated DNA analysis. Additionally, the technology, while advanced, could only match DNA profiles to known individuals in databases, limiting its power if the killer's DNA was never collected. Impact on public interest. The renewed investigation reignited public interest. Newspaper articles, TV reports and documentaries examined the case with fresh eyes. People debated theories online, hoping someone might finally solve the mystery. Yet, Despite this surge of attention and scientific effort, the Lake Bodom murders remain officially unsolved. The mystery continues. The advances in forensic science gave new hope, but also highlighted the limits of technology. No matter how many new tools become available, some secrets may remain buried beneath the surface, much like the still dark waters of Lake Bodom itself. The victims' stories continue to inspire curiosity, fear, and a desire for justice. For now, the question of who committed these brutal murders remains open, waiting for the day when new evidence might finally reveal the truth. Beyond the forensic puzzles and the haunting mystery, there were 4 young lives forever changed in the early hours of June 5, 1960. The victims, Einar, Anja, and Seppo, along with Nils, survived but carried deep wounds, both physical and emotional. Understanding their stories, and the effect on their families, adds a deeply human layer to this tragic tale. Einar and Anja's backgrounds. Einar Gustafsson was a 17-year-old boy described by friends and family as kind and spirited. He was known for his love of the outdoors and his friendly, easygoing nature. His sister Anja, just 15, was a lively and bright girl, full of potential and dreams of her own. The siblings came from a close-knit family in Espoo, Finland, with a quiet suburban life that was forever shattered that summer night. Seppo's story. Seppo Boisman was 18 years old, an athletic young man with a passion for fishing and camping. Known for his humor and leadership qualities, Seppo was the unofficial leader of the group camping at Lake Bodom. He was the victim whose life was taken most cruelly, but he remains a symbol of youth and vitality lost too soon. Nils Gustafsson. The survivor. Nils Gustafsson, the only survivor, was 15 years old at the time. He sustained serious injuries, including a head wound that left scars and deep psychological trauma. Over the years, Nils struggled with the weight of survival. He lived with both physical pain and the heavy burden of witnessing such violence. Nils' story became intertwined with the investigation, as suspicion and scrutiny fell on him, yet forensic evidence later cleared him. The family's pain and perseverance. The families of the victims endured unimaginable grief. They were left grappling not only with the loss, but also with unanswered questions. For decades, they sought closure and justice, holding on to hope that the truth would one day emerge. Some family members participated in interviews, documentaries, and public appeals, showing remarkable courage in the face of ongoing mystery. Community response. The murders shocked the quiet Finnish community. Parents became more protective, and camping trips lost some of their innocence. Lake Bodom, once a place of natural beauty and adventure, took on a darker reputation, a haunting reminder of tragedy. Yet, the community also showed resilience, commemorating the victims and supporting their families through memorials and gatherings. The long shadow of trauma. Survivors and families dealt with trauma in different ways, some retreating from the public eye, others becoming advocates for justice or mental health awareness. The psychological scars of the night left an indelible mark on everyone involved, highlighting the long-lasting effects of violent crime. Remembering the victims. Despite the darkness surrounding the case, the victims are remembered not only for their tragic end, but for the lives they led and the dreams they had. Their stories remind us of the preciousness of life and the human cost behind headlines and investigations. Moving forward, though the Lake Bodom murders remain unsolved, the continued remembrance and pursuit of justice keep the victims' memories alive. It is a testament to the enduring power of hope and the human spirit's refusal to be silenced. After the initial shock and grief, the focus shifted to finding who was responsible for the horrific attack at Lake Bodom. From the very start, investigators faced a labyrinth of clues, dead ends, and complex human stories. Over the decades, various suspects and theories emerged, but none have conclusively solved the case. Early police investigation. The night of the murders, local police began searching for suspects in the nearby areas. They interviewed campers, locals, and anyone who had been near the lake. However, the remote location and the lack of witnesses made the investigation challenging. The police quickly ruled out robbery since valuables were untouched, and the brutality suggested a deeply personal or psychopathic motive. Initial suspects. One of the first suspects was a young man named Hans Assmann, who had reportedly argued with the victims shortly before the murders. However, he had a solid alibi, and was soon cleared. Another early theory focused on a vagrant man living nearby, known to have a violent past. However, he was not linked conclusively to the crime. Nils Gustafsson's suspicions. Over time, suspicion fell on Nils Gustafsson, the sole survivor. His injuries were questioned by some who doubted how he could have survived with the wounds he sustained. Nils was interrogated multiple times over the years and faced rumors and accusations. Some speculated he might have been involved in a tragic accident or altercation that led to the deaths. Despite this, no solid evidence ever tied him to the murders, and he was officially cleared by forensic analysis. The Bodom killer theory. The idea of a single Bodom killer persisted. Some believed a psychopathic stranger attacked the group randomly, driven by violent urges or mental illness. This theory aligns with the nature of the wounds, the targeted brutality, and the lack of motive like theft. Yet, no credible suspect matching this profile was ever arrested or identified. Connection to other crimes. Over the years, some speculated that the Lake Bodom murders were connected to other violent crimes in Finland or Scandinavia, possibly the work of a serial killer. Investigators compared evidence to similar cases, but found no definitive links. Modern investigations and DNA testing advances in forensic science rekindled interest in the case. In the early 2000s, DNA samples from the crime scene were re-examined with new technology. Unfortunately, the age of the evidence and contamination issues made it difficult to obtain clear results. Still, experts hoped that modern methods might one day reveal the killer's identity. Ongoing cold case efforts. Finnish police have reopened the case periodically, especially when new tips or forensic advances arose. They interviewed witnesses anew, rechecked old evidence, and collaborated with international experts. Despite these efforts, the mystery remains, with only a handful of serious suspects ever considered. Theories that refuse to die. Public fascination with the Lake Bodom murders has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and theories. Some suggest a jealous ex-lover, others believe it was a hate crime, while conspiracy theories propose cover-ups. The lack of closure keeps the case alive in public imagination. Why the case remains unsolved? Several factors contribute to the enduring mystery: the remoteness of the crime scene, the brutality that left little forensic trace, and the passage of time eroding evidence and memories. Additionally, the absence of eyewitnesses and the victim's own silence, they perished or survived with limited ability to identify their attacker, complicate matters. The human need for answers. Despite decades of silence from the case, the human desire for truth, justice, and understanding persists. The Lake Bodom murders stand as a chilling reminder of how some crimes defy explanation, yet they demand that we never forget. The Lake Bodom murders have become more than just a cold case. They are a haunting part of Finnish history and culture. The brutal deaths of those 4 teenagers sent shockwaves through the country and left a lasting scar on the community near the lake. Impact on the local community. The small town near Lake Bodom was forever changed by the events of that tragic night in 1960. For years afterward, families were hesitant to let their children camp near the lake or explore the surrounding woods. Local folklore grew around the area, and the lake itself took on a sinister reputation, becoming a place both feared and shrouded in mystery. Memorials and remembering the victims. Over time, memorials were established to honor the lives lost. Friends and family gathered annually to remember the victims, hoping their memories might one day bring some measure of peace. These memorials serve as a reminder of the human lives behind the headlines and statistics. Teenagers with hopes, dreams, and futures cut tragically short. The case's place in true crime history. The Lake Bodom murders have been studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals worldwide. The case represents one of the earliest examples of a brutal, unsolved attack on young campers, a case that challenges investigators even decades later. Many experts reference the case when discussing cold cases, violent crime patterns, and the evolution of forensic science. Inspiration for art and media. The mystery and darkness of Lake Bodom have inspired countless works of fiction, documentaries, and music. Finnish heavy metal band Children of Bodom even took their name from the case, reflecting how deeply it resonates culturally. Numerous books and films have attempted to explore the events, sometimes blending fact with speculation, but always drawing attention to the unsolved nature of the crime. What the case teaches us beyond the mystery and horror. The Lake Bodom murders teach us about the importance of justice and the limits of human knowledge. The case reminds us how fragile life can be, how evil can strike without warning, and how even with all our modern tools, some mysteries endure. Why we keep returning to such stories like Lake Bodom, touch on a primal human fascination with darkness, danger, and the unknown. They force us to confront fear and mortality, and in doing so we seek understanding, perhaps not only of the crimes themselves but of ourselves. A legacy of silence and questions despite the passage of more than 6 decades. The Lake Bodom murders remain an open wound in the collective memory. No conclusive answers have emerged. No final justice has been served. Only questions linger, like shadows on the surface of the dark Finnish lake. In the years following the tragedy at Lake Bodom, investigators faced numerous challenges that kept the case frustratingly open and unsolved. The forensic methods available in 1960 were limited compared to today's standards, and the preservation of evidence was not always handled with the care that modern investigators would expect. Despite this, the case attracted attention from experts and amateur sleuths alike, each hoping to uncover new leads or piece together overlooked clues. One of the biggest obstacles in the investigation was the inconsistent and sometimes conflicting testimonies of the surviving witness, Nils Gustafsson. His statements fluctuated over time, partly due to trauma but also because of the intense pressure from law enforcement and the public. His shifting narratives made it difficult for police to pin down a clear timeline or suspect profile, fueling speculation and suspicion not only around him but around many others connected to the case. In 2004, decades after the murders, the case took a surprising turn when DNA evidence was re-examined using new advanced technology. Investigators found traces of DNA at the crime scene that did not match any of the victims or Nils Gustafsson. This discovery briefly rekindled hopes that the identity of the killer might finally be revealed. However, the DNA did not match any known suspects, leading to further frustration and questions. The inability to link the DNA to a living individual left the case open once more and deepened the mystery. Around the same time, Nils Gustafsson was officially named a suspect by authorities, largely because of the inconsistencies in his accounts and his presence at the scene. However, he was never formally charged, and after years of investigation, the case against him was dropped. Nils maintained his innocence until his death in 2013, adding another layer of complexity and ambiguity to the case. Despite the setbacks, the persistence of investigators and researchers ensured that the Lake Bodom murders remained in the spotlight. Cold case units, true crime enthusiasts, and even genealogists have examined every available detail, hoping modern forensic science, such as genetic genealogy, might one day finally solve the crime. Beyond the forensic challenges, the social context of 1960s Finland played a role in how the case unfolded. The country was still recovering from the upheavals of World War II, and law enforcement resources were limited. The small community around Lake Bodom was not accustomed to violent crime of this nature, which may have slowed the investigative process. Furthermore, attitudes toward mental health, trauma, and witness protection were very different then, affecting how witnesses like Nils were treated and questioned. The story of Lake Bodom remains one of the most haunting in Nordic crime history, partly because it touches on something universal, the vulnerability of youth and the terror of an unknown predator lurking in the dark. The fact that the killer was never caught haunts not only the families and survivors, but also the collective conscience of those who know the story. While justice remains elusive, the case has sparked important conversations about crime prevention, forensic science, and how communities respond to tragedy. It serves as a reminder that even in remote and peaceful settings, darkness can take hold, and the pursuit of truth often requires patience, perseverance, and the hope that one day answers will come. The haunting silence of Lake Bodom after that tragic night continued to weigh heavily on the local community for decades. Families lived with the shadow of the unsolved murders, and the lake itself became a place wrapped in eerie legend and whispered fears. Stories circulated in hushed tones, some fueled by speculation, others by genuine encounters and strange happenings. Over the years, the murders inspired numerous books, documentaries, and investigations. True crime enthusiasts from around the world became fascinated with the case, drawn to its chilling details and the frustrating lack of closure. This international attention kept the memory of the victims alive and ensured that the search for answers never completely faded. In 2015, a Finnish documentary crew produced a detailed investigation into the murders, interviewing surviving family members, local historians, and experts in forensic science. Their work shed new light on the cultural and historical context of the crime, exploring how Finnish society at the time grappled with the tragedy, and how it influenced law enforcement procedures going forward. The documentary also revisited the scene at Lake Bodom, capturing the eerie beauty of the area, and contrasting it with the horror that unfolded there. Viewers were reminded that behind the serene lake and peaceful forest lay a story of violence and loss that still echoes through time. Interestingly, the case has also inspired theories that reach beyond the realm of conventional crime investigation. Some locals speculated about supernatural influences, while others believed that the murders were connected to secret government operations or espionage, given Finland's position during the Cold War era. While these ideas remain unproven and largely speculative, they add layers of mystery that continue to intrigue the public.
Forensic advances continued to bring hope to the case. In 2016, Finnish police announced plans to use the latest DNA technology to try once again to identify the killer. They hoped that by revisiting evidence stored for decades, they could find a genetic match in international databases, possibly identifying the murderer or confirming the innocence of previous suspects. Despite these efforts, no definitive breakthrough has emerged. The true identity of the person who committed the Lake Bodom murders remains a chilling unknown. The silence from the shadows of the past speaks volumes about the limitations of justice and the fragility of human memory. The case reminds us of the importance of continual advancements in forensic science and investigative techniques, as well as the need for compassion and care when dealing with survivors and communities affected by violent crime. Lake Bodom's story is a somber chapter in the annals of crime history, a mystery that still waits patiently for answers. It calls on us to remember the victims, honor their memory, and hold on to hope that one day the truth will come to light, bringing peace to those who have long sought it. As the sun sets over Lake Bodom, the tranquil waters hide secrets beneath their surface, secrets that may never fully be revealed, but that continue to inspire curiosity and a quest for understanding in all who hear the story. As the years passed, the cultural impact of the Lake Bodom murders extended beyond Finland's borders. The case became part of a global tapestry of unsolved mysteries that captivated true crime followers worldwide. It influenced art, music, and literature, most notably inspiring the Finnish heavy metal band Children of Bodom, whose very name pays tribute to the tragedy and the haunting atmosphere surrounding the lake. The lasting presence of the murders in popular culture speaks to how deeply these events have embedded themselves in the collective consciousness. The fear, the questions, and the grief continue to resonate, reminding us that some crimes leave scars that never fully heal. Beyond the cultural echoes, the families of the victims faced a life forever altered. The trauma and loss they endured shaped their lives in profound ways, often in silence. Interviews and memoirs reveal the ongoing struggle to find closure when the identity of the killer remains unknown, a silent presence that shadows every memory of that night. In addition to forensic and police investigations, amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts have tirelessly examined the case. Online forums and investigative podcasts have created communities dedicated to piecing together clues, sharing theories, and keeping the victims' stories alive. This modern grassroots interest underscores how technology and collective memory can keep unsolved cases in the public eye. One of the most puzzling aspects remains the profile of the murderer. Based on the crime scene and the nature of the attacks, experts have debated whether the perpetrator was someone local or a transient, whether the killings were planned or impulsive, and whether the attacker had personal motives or was a stranger driven by darker compulsions. The lack of witnesses and physical evidence, despite thorough police work, has made it difficult to construct a complete picture. Some investigators have speculated about the killer's psychological profile, suggesting traits of impulsiveness, cunning, or possibly a history of mental illness. However, without concrete evidence, these remain educated guesses rather than facts. Meanwhile, the community around Lake Bodom learned to live with the legacy of the murders. Some residents avoided the area after dark, wary of the shadows and stories that still lurked there. Others worked hard to reclaim the lake's identity, emphasizing its natural beauty and recreational opportunities rather than its dark past. The lake today stands as a paradox, a place of both beauty and sorrow, of life and lingering questions. Visitors come to fish, swim, and hike, sometimes unaware of the tragic events that took place more than half a century ago, yet the stories persist, woven into the very fabric of the landscape. As technology evolves and cold case units improve their methods, hope remains that one day the truth about the Lake Bodom murders will emerge. Until then, the story continues to be retold, a reminder of the enduring human desire to seek justice and understand the mysteries of the past. Over the decades, new technologies have offered fresh hope for solving the Lake Bodom murders. Advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, have revolutionized the way cold cases can be reopened and investigated. As methods became more sophisticated, evidence once considered useless was re-examined in hopes of uncovering new leads. In the early 2000s, Finnish authorities reopened the case, using modern techniques to analyze any remaining physical evidence. Unfortunately, many original samples had degraded or were lost, a common challenge in decades-old investigations. Still, some traces remained, allowing for partial DNA profiles to be extracted, though no definitive match was found in the national databases. The re-examination sparked renewed media interest and public fascination, bringing attention back to the tragedy. Several individuals came forward with new information or suspicions, though none led to concrete breakthroughs. The enigmatic nature of the crime persisted, underscoring the difficulty of solving cases with limited physical evidence and no eyewitnesses. One particularly notable moment came when a suspect emerged in the public eye, a man named Nils Gustafsson. He was convicted in the 1960s for an unrelated attempted manslaughter, but had always been a figure of suspicion for some. In the 2000s, new witness statements and circumstantial evidence were reanalyzed, placing Gustafsson closer to the crime scene around the time of the murders. However, despite the interest in Gustafsson, prosecutors eventually dropped the case against him due to insufficient evidence, and he maintained his innocence until his death. This outcome further deepened the mystery, illustrating how the passage of time and lack of definitive proof can frustrate even the most determined investigators. The unresolved nature of the Lake Bodom murders continues to fuel speculation. Some theorists propose that the killings were the work of a transient stranger, while others suggest a more personal motive, involving jealousy or a conflict between acquaintances. Without eyewitness testimony or concrete forensic links, these theories remain speculative but compelling. The families of the victims, while yearning for answers, have had to grapple with the reality of uncertainty. The pain of losing loved ones is compounded by the lack of closure, a void left by unanswered questions and the absence of justice. Yet, despite the tragedy, the story of the Lake Bodom murders serves as a solemn reminder of the importance of persistence in criminal investigations. It highlights the evolution of forensic science and the tireless efforts of law enforcement and communities to remember victims and seek truth. As listeners, we are invited to reflect on the complexities of justice and memory, understanding that not every mystery has a neat ending. Some stories remain open, echoing through time, urging us to listen, learn, and never forget. As the years passed, the Lake Bodom murders became a haunting chapter in Finnish history, a chilling reminder of how a quiet summer night could be shattered forever. Despite the frustrations of an unsolved case, the story left a lasting impact on both local communities and true crime enthusiasts around the world. In the decades following the tragedy, the lake and its surroundings took on an eerie significance. What was once a peaceful spot for camping and relaxation became synonymous with mystery and loss. Visitors often approached with a mix of curiosity and caution, aware of the dark history that lingered beneath the surface. For the families, the pain remained vivid. They organized memorials, anniversaries, and community gatherings to honor the memories of Seppo, Omeli, and the others. Their hope was that through remembrance, some healing might be found, even without answers. The case also influenced Finnish police procedures and forensic practices. Authorities recognized the challenges of investigating violent crimes in remote locations and sought to improve evidence collection and preservation. These lessons, born from tragedy, helped shape future investigative protocols. Internationally, the Lake Bodom murders captured imaginations, inspiring books, documentaries, and artistic works. It became a symbol of the unsolved and the unknown, proof that some shadows in the human story resist illumination. In recent years, technology continues to evolve. Techniques like genetic genealogy, which helped solve cases long thought cold in other countries, offer a glimmer of hope. If new evidence or DNA emerges, there's a chance the mystery could finally be unraveled. For now, the lake remains silent witness, its waters reflecting the quiet stars above, holding secrets beneath their depths. The past and present coexist here, wrapped in the mist of memory and unanswered questions. As you listen to this story, you join a long tradition of those who seek to understand and remember. The Lake Bodom murders remind us that even in darkness, the human desire for truth endures. As we reach the end of this story, it's important to pause and reflect on the many lives touched by the tragedy at Lake Bodom. Though the case remains officially unsolved, the memories of Seppo, Omeli, and the others endure, etched not only in history books, but in the hearts of those who loved them. True crime stories often focus on the mystery and the hunt for justice. Yet, beyond the headlines and theories, there are real people, families who grieve, communities who heal slowly, and a society that learns from its darkest moments. The Lake Bodom murders are a poignant reminder of how fragile life can be, how moments of joy can turn into nightmares, and how some questions may never find answers. But the search for truth continues, fueled by hope, new technology, and the dedication of investigators and citizens alike. As you reflect on this story, consider the ways in which we all confront the unknown. Some mysteries challenge us, while others teach us to hold space for silence, patience, and remembrance. Whether you listened out of curiosity, for comfort, or to honor the memory of those lost, thank you for joining this journey. Stories like these connect us to history, to each other, and to the ongoing quest for understanding in an often puzzling world. If you found this narration engaging, feel free to explore more stories that delve into history's shadows with calm curiosity and respectful storytelling. Take a moment now to breathe deeply, letting the quiet settle as the story fades. The night is long, and the search for peace, much like the search for truth, is a path walked with patience and care. Thank you for listening.